The military dog stopped in the middle of the pawn shop floor. Not a pause, not a sniff, a full, planted stop. 70 pounds of trained Belgian Malinois refusing to move another inch. His handler tugged the leash once. The dog didn't look at him, he was looking at her. The woman at the counter, the one in the worn scrubs with the dark circles under her eyes, and a small canvas pouch sitting on the glass case between her hands. She hadn't said much, just slid the pouch forward and asked what they were worth. The dog crossed the floor in 4 steps and sat down beside her left leg like he'd been doing it his whole life. And when the handler stepped forward to pull him back, he caught a glimpse of the metal inside the pouch. And he went still too, because he recognized the engraving. Before we go any further, if stories like this one keep you up at night, hit follow so you never miss what comes next. Leave a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The pawn shop on Delacroix Avenue had the particular smell of things people gave up on. Old electronics, leather that had dried out, metal going dull in cases that hadn't been cleaned in months. A ceiling fan wobbled overhead without doing much about the heat. The man behind the counter, heavy set with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, was in the middle of pricing a vintage wristwatch when the door opened and the bell above it gave its tired little ring. He glanced up. A woman in green scrubs, late 30s, maybe 40, brown hair pulled back tight, a few strands loose at the temple, a canvas messenger bag over one shoulder and something in her hand. A small pouch, the kind that zipped at the top, military surplus olive drab. She looked like someone who had been awake for 20 hours and didn't plan to stop anytime soon. "I need to know what these are worth," she said, and put the pouch on the counter. He unzipped it slowly, tilted it. A few medals slid out onto the glass, the kind that came with ribbons, the kind the government handed out for things it didn't want to explain in detail. He picked one up, turned it over, squinted. "Military?" "Yes." "Yours?" She didn't answer right away. "Yes." He set it down and looked at her differently, not unkindly, just assessing. "These are real. You got paperwork to go with them?" "No paperwork, just the medals." He sucked air through his teeth. "Without documentation, I can't move these for much. Maybe 40, 50 apiece if I find the right." The bell above the door rang again. She didn't turn around. She was watching the man's expression shift, calculating whether $40 times however many medals she had was going to cover the gas bill and the clinic copay she'd been avoiding since February. The dog came in first. She heard the click of nails on linoleum. Then nothing, which was stranger than something because working dogs didn't stop moving unless they had a reason. She heard the handler say the dog's name, short, sharp, a command, and then heard nothing after that. She turned. The Belgian Malinois was sitting beside her left leg, not sniffing her, not circling, just sitting, square and certain, like he'd been assigned to her. His handler was a man maybe 10 years older than her, broad-shouldered, standing the way people stood when they'd spent years being responsible for things that mattered. Close-cropped hair going gray at the sides. He was looking at the dog with the expression of someone whose animal had just done something that didn't make sense, and he was trying to decide whether to be embarrassed or alarmed. "Ranger," he said. "Heel." The dog didn't move. The man came forward, reached for the leash, and that's when he saw what was on the counter. He stopped. He picked up the medal the shopkeeper had been examining. The same one, turned it over, read the back. His voice came out quieter than he probably intended. "Where did you get this?" She looked at him. "I told him already. It's mine." He turned it over again, read the engraving again, like the first time might have been wrong. His jaw moved once without saying anything. Then he looked up at her. "What's your name?" She held his gaze. "Nora Voss." Something moved across his face. Recognition, but not the casual kind. The kind that pulls up from somewhere you filed away a long time ago and thought you'd never need again. "Sergeant Marcus Hale," he said. "Retired. 75th Ranger Regiment." She said nothing. "I know whose medal this is," he said quietly, "and I know the name on the back of it. But the woman who earned this was reported as discharged for conduct unbecoming. Record sealed. Career ended." He set the medal down carefully. "So I'm going to ask you again. Who are you?" Nora Voss picked up the medal, zipped it back into the pouch, and put it in her bag. "I'm a nurse," she said, "and I'm late for my shift." She walked out. The dog watched her go. Hale Orthopedic and Trauma Center sat on the north edge of Calverton, Oregon, in that particular no man's land between the older industrial district and the newer residential sprawl that had been creeping out from the city's center for the last decade. It wasn't a bad hospital. It wasn't a great one. It had the competent, slightly worn feel of an institution that processed a lot of people on not quite enough budget. Good nurses, overworked residents, an administrative floor that seemed more concerned with billing codes than with anything that happened below it. Nora had been working the night shift here for 2 years. She clocked in at 6:47, 13 minutes before she was supposed to, because she was always early and nobody had ever once noticed. She stashed her bag in the locker room, changed into fresh scrubs, a different shade of green, slightly faded from too many washes, and tied her hair back properly this time. The charge nurse at the handoff, a woman named Patricia, who was fast and efficient and had absolutely no patience for people who weren't, ran through the night's cases in about 4 minutes flat. Bay 3, Mrs. Okafor, hip replacement post-op, pain management. Bay 7, Mr. Trentino, 62, admitted for chest pressure. Cardiology ordered the echo this morning, but it hasn't happened yet. Bay 9, one Marcus Hale. Marcus Hale, as in the guy who... Nora kept her face perfectly neutral. Patricia looked up from the tablet. "You okay?" "Fine. Keep going." Hale, Bay 9, walked in about an hour ago. Said his service dog was acting strange and he wanted to get checked out. No symptoms, no vitals of concern. Honestly, I think the ER doc who admitted him was just being careful because the guy showed some kind of federal contractor ID. She lowered her voice slightly. Or maybe because the dog sat in the intake chair and refused to leave. "What's wrong with the dog?" "Nothing that we know of. Dog's out in the hall. There's apparently some policy about..." Patricia waved her hand. "You'll figure it out. He asked for you." Nora's hand slowed. "He doesn't know me," she said. "He asked for the nurse who was at the pawn shop on Delacroix this evening." Patricia looked at her with the mild curiosity of someone who had worked long enough to stop being surprised by most things. "I'm guessing that's you?" It was. She didn't go to Bay 9 first. She went to Bay 7, checked on Mr. Trentino, read his chart, noted that the echo was still sitting in the queue and nobody had pushed it through, and spent 7 minutes listening to his chest with her stethoscope because he had a pattern of sounds that was slightly off from what his intake numbers suggested, and she wanted to be sure she was reading it right. She was reading it right. But she flagged it anyway, left a note in the system for the cardiologist, and moved on. Mrs. Okafor in Bay 3 was doing well and mostly wanted company. Nora sat with her for 4 minutes, adjusted her pillow, confirmed her pain was manageable, and promised to check back in 2 hours. Then she walked to Bay 9. Marcus Hale was sitting up on the exam table, jacket off, rolling his right sleeve back down over a forearm that carried 3 parallel scars that were old enough to be fully silvered. He looked up when she came in. His face didn't change much, but something behind his eyes settled, like he'd been waiting for her and was relieved she'd actually shown up. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "No," he agreed. "If you needed a conversation with me, you could have just asked, outside before I left." "You didn't leave me a lot of opportunity." She picked up his chart without sitting down. His vitals were normal. His intake reason was listed as service animal behavioral concern with a note about the contractor ID and a question mark in the margin that the ER doc had clearly put there as a placeholder. There was nothing medically wrong with him. "You're not sick," she said. "No? So you checked yourself into an ER to talk to me." "Ranger doesn't behave that way," he said. "In 4 years, I've never seen him break position to approach a stranger. That dog has worked active deployments. He does not break position." He paused. "He sat beside you, like he was guarding you." "Dogs do things," she said. "It doesn't mean..." "The medal," he said. "The one with the engraving. Do you know what it's for?" She looked at the chart. "The woman who earned that medal," he said, "was a combat medic. Army. She was attached to a classified operation in a region I'm not going to name in a hospital room, and during that operation something went wrong. Not accidentally. The route was compromised. Her team walked into something they shouldn't have walked into, and she made a call that her commanding officer hadn't authorized. He watched her face. That call saved 9 lives. You should get some rest, she said. I'll have someone bring... They discharged her for it, he said. Insubordination, conduct unbecoming. The records got sealed inside of a week, and the officer who filed the charge had a promotion process through the same office 3 months later. He let that sit. I was in a position to know some of what happened back then. I wasn't senior enough to stop it. By the time I understood what I was looking at, the paperwork was done. Nora set the chart down on the counter. Mr. Hale, she said, I don't know what you want from me. I want to know what really happened on that operation. She looked at him for a long moment. Get some sleep, she said. I'll check on you in an hour. She left. In the hallway, she stopped and pressed the back of her hand against the wall, held it there, breathed, chat. The rest of the night moved the way night shifts do when nothing major has happened yet. A sustained low-grade tension broken up by small problems and small decisions and the quiet particular to a hospital after midnight, when the sounds narrow down to equipment and footsteps and the occasional voice at a distance. Nora moved through it with the efficiency she'd learned over 2 years of doing this particular job and a longer time before that of doing other jobs in worse conditions. She checked vitals, updated charts, answered call buttons. She came back to Mr. Trentino at 11 and noted that his discomfort was increasing in a way she didn't love, and she flagged the chart again with more urgency this time. At 12:14, a new admission came through. Male, early 20s, brought in by a friend who said he'd been complaining about stomach pain for 2 days and had gotten progressively worse through the evening. The ER doc on rotation, a second-year resident named Wakefield who was smart and fast and occasionally made the mistake of assuming those 2 things were enough, did an assessment, ordered standard labs, and wrote it up as likely gastroenteritis pending results. Nora came in to do the intake nursing assessment after he left. The kid's name was Jalen. He was 23 and he had the slightly glassy look of someone who had been in real pain for long enough to start dissociating from it. His friend, still in the corner of the room in a winter coat that was 2 sizes too large, had the look of someone who had been scared for hours and was now performing calm because he'd run out of room for scared. Nora went through the standard questions. Pain location, onset, associated symptoms. Jalen answered in short sentences. His answers were normal enough on the surface, but when she pressed lightly on his lower right abdomen, his whole body flinched before he could control it. She pressed a different spot. He flinched again. She noted his temperature, 38.6, which the chart had logged as mildly elevated. She noted the way he was lying, slightly curled toward the right, which people did instinctively when something on that side hurt. She noted that he'd told her the pain had started around his navel 2 days ago and migrated. She pressed once more, carefully, in the right lower quadrant, and then released quickly. He gasped. Rebound tenderness. She straightened up and wrote 3 words in her notes, then walked out of the bay, found Wakefield at the station, and waited until he looked up. Your gastroenteritis in Bay 4 needs a surgical consult, she said. Wakefield looked at her with the particular expression of someone who was tired and had just had their assessment questioned by a nurse. Labs aren't back yet. He's got rebound tenderness in the right lower quadrant. Pain migrated from periumbilical. 2-day history. Temperature trending up. I'm aware of the temperature. Then you know what that pattern looks like. I know what a lot of patterns look like. He said it without malice, which was almost worse. The labs will be back in 40 minutes. If the white count is elevated, we'll escalate. If his appendix perforates in the next 40 minutes, Nurse Voss. He said her name the way people said a thing when they wanted to close a conversation. Not cruel, just final. I'll review the labs when they're ready. Thank you. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she went back to Bay 4. Jalen, she said, pulling a chair close. Has anyone in your family had appendix problems? He blinked. My uncle. Why? She kept her voice level. I'm going to ask the doctor to look at you again. In the meantime, I don't want you eating or drinking anything. Not even water, okay? Is it bad? She looked at him. I don't know yet, but I'd rather be careful than not. She documented everything, precise times, precise observations, precise language. Every symptom, every response to palpation, every vital she'd taken since walking in. Then she pulled up the system and sent a direct message to the surgical resident on call, Dr. Amara Osei, with a summary and a request for urgent evaluation. It wasn't protocol. It was close enough to protocol that nobody could definitively say it wasn't, and it was the right call. She knew it was the right call, the same way she'd known other calls were right, in other places, under other circumstances, when the cost of being wrong was not a charted complaint, but something measured in a different currency entirely. Wakefield found her at the station 15 minutes later. "You paged surgery," he said. "I sent a consult request, yes. I hadn't ordered a consult. I noted that in my documentation." His jaw tightened. "You went around me." "I went to the available resource when I believed the timeline was urgent." She kept her voice even, not defensive, not aggressive, just factual. "If I'm wrong, it costs us an unnecessary consult. If I'm right, you're a nurse, Voss." There it was, not a description, a boundary marker. "I'm the person in that room," she said. He stared at her. Then he walked away. Dr. Osei arrived 12 minutes later, did her own assessment in under 4 minutes, and called the OR. Jalen's appendix was removed at 2:17 a.m. It had been 48 hours from perforation. The surgeon's notes afterward would describe it as hours away from septic complication. Nora was at the nurse's station when they wheeled him past. He looked up at her with heavy eyes and said, "You were right." She nodded once. "Get some rest." She was finishing her charting at 4:30 when Patricia appeared beside her with the expression of someone delivering news they didn't want to deliver. "You've got a message from administration." Nora looked up. "Thornfield's office." Patricia's voice had gone carefully neutral. "They want you to come in at 9, before your next shift." Richard Thornfield was the director of nursing operations, a title that sounded more clinical than it was. He was primarily an administrative creature, more comfortable with compliance reviews and staffing reports than with anything that involved a patient, and he was the kind of administrator who moved on complaints quickly and questions slowly. "About what?" Nora said. "It just says to discuss a licensing matter." Patricia paused. "It came in at 2:40. While you were I know when it came in." She said it more sharply than she meant to. Patricia looked at the floor for a moment. "I'm sorry," Nora said. I'm sorry. It's fine." Patricia's voice was quiet. "I just thought you should know it came in during your shift, while the Jalen situation was still going on." Nora stared at the message on the screen. A licensing matter. The language was deliberately vague in the way that administrative language was when it wanted to sound routine while covering something specific. She thought about the complaint Wakefield could have filed in the last 2 hours. She thought about how fast that kind of complaint moved when the right people were already looking for a reason. She thought about a pawn shop on Delacroix Avenue and a metal she'd been trying to convert into a gas bill. And she thought quietly about how this had happened before. Not in a hospital. In a different kind of institution, with a different chain of command and a different set of rules, but the same machinery underneath. The machinery that moved when you made a decision that inconvenienced someone with more authority than you. And it moved quietly, and it moved fast. And by the time you understood what it was doing, the paperwork was already done. She logged out of her station, went to the locker room, got her bag, stopped in the hallway outside Bay 9. The dog was still there, lying in front of the door, head on his paws. He looked up when she stopped. She looked at him for a moment. Then she pushed the door open. Hale was awake. He'd probably been awake for a while. He was sitting with his elbows on his knees, looking at the floor, and when she came in, he looked up and read her face in one quick pass the way people read things when they'd been trained to read things fast. "What happened?" he said. She sat down in the chair across from him. Not the nurse's posture she'd been holding all night. The other one. The one that was tired and honest and had run out of space for pretending things were fine. "I need you to tell me," she said, "what you actually know, not what you think. What you know." He looked at her for a long moment. "Sit tight," he said. "I'll tell you everything." Outside, in the pale gray beginning of a Calverton morning, her phone lit up with a call from a number she didn't recognize. She let it ring. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. And then, 30 seconds later, it rang again. She answered on the 5th ring. Silence on the other end. Not dead air. Occupied silence, the kind where someone was deciding something. Then a voice. Male, older, careful. Is this Nora Voss? Who's asking? My name is Warren Stull. I'm a retired CID warrant officer. I've been trying to reach you for about 6 weeks. A pause. I think you know why. She didn't say anything. I'm not calling to cause you trouble, he said. I'm calling because the trouble found you again and I'd like to help before it finishes what it started 7 years ago. She looked at Hale. He was watching her face. She turned the phone slightly so he couldn't read her expression and walked to the window where the parking lot was gray and mostly empty in the early morning light. A few cars scattered like afterthoughts. How did you get this number? She said. I've had it for a while. I just waited until I had something worth saying. Another pause. Your name came up in a file review 2 months ago. The review was supposed to be routine. It wasn't. Someone flagged your discharge record for what they called a secondary audit, and the person who ordered that audit is the same person who signed the original conduct charge 7 years ago. Her jaw tightened. I can meet you, Stull said. Not at the hospital, somewhere public. Your choice. She thought about the message from Thornfield's office. 9 a.m. A licensing matter. And now this, 30 seconds behind it, like something had been released simultaneously, and she was standing in the gap between 2 things moving toward her from opposite directions. Give me a number, she said. I'll call you back. She hung up. Turned around. Hale was still watching her. That was someone named Stull, she said. Says he's CID, retired. Says my discharge record just got flagged for re-audit. She sat down in the chair again. By the person who originally filed the charge. Hale's expression didn't change, but something in it went very still. Hargrove. I didn't say a name. You didn't have to. He rubbed the side of his jaw. Colonel Dale Hargrove. He's not a colonel anymore. He's Brigadier General Hargrove now, and he's been on the short list for a 2nd star for the last 18 months. His eyes met hers. A sealed conduct charge on a former subordinate isn't a problem unless someone starts asking questions about it. If questions are being asked, then he needs the charge to stay clean, she said. He needs the charge to stay clean, Hale confirmed, which means he needs you to stay exactly where you are, invisible. No complaint, no review, no one looking at the original documentation. She thought about that for a moment. Thought about the timing of it. Stull's call, Thornfield's message, all of it landing within the same 12-hour window as her standing in a pawn shop with a bag of metals she'd been planning to quietly sell so she could pay a bill. Someone saw me today, she said, at the pawn shop, before you walked in. Hale frowned. What do you mean? There was a man browsing the case when I came in. I didn't think anything of it. He left about 2 minutes after I arrived. She paused. He had a phone out. Hale was quiet for a moment. You think you were flagged? I think if someone's been doing a secondary audit of my records, they might have eyes on more than just the paperwork. She said it flatly, without self-pity, which was the only way she knew how to say things that should have been alarming. It was a habit from a long time ago, kind of deliberate flatness that kept the part of your brain that managed fear from spending too much energy on things that hadn't happened yet. Hale leaned back. Tell me about the mission. She looked at him for a long time. Not here, she said. Not now. She stood up, checked his discharge paperwork. Medically, he was cleared to leave, had been for hours. I have a meeting at 9 with hospital administration. After that, she stopped. We'll see what's left after that. She went home first. Home was a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that had been renovated badly in the 90s and not touched since. The windows let in cold at the edges in winter, and the elevator sounded like it was going through something personal every time she used it. It was fine. It was hers, or would be hers for another month, assuming the check she'd planned to write from the metal money didn't bounce. She showered and changed and stood at the kitchen counter, eating half a piece of toast and looking at the manila folder she kept at the back of the cabinet behind the cereal boxes. She'd looked at it enough times over 7 years that she didn't need to open it to know what was in it. A photocopy of the original charge document, a handwritten timeline she'd made 3 weeks after the discharge, while everything was still clear in her memory. 4 photographs she'd taken on a disposable camera. Disposable because she'd known, even then, that digital records were easier to access and alter. And a folded sheet of paper with a sequence of radio communication timestamps that she'd written from memory the night she got home, before she slept, before she let herself feel anything about any of it. She didn't take the folder. She thought about it, then left it where it was. She'd kept it there for 7 years. One morning wasn't going to make the difference. And she wasn't ready to be the person who walked into that administrative meeting carrying evidence. Not yet. Not until she understood exactly what she was walking into. Thornfield's office was on the 4th floor, in the administrative wing that had carpet instead of linoleum, and a particular silence that felt imposed rather than natural. She arrived at 8:54 and sat in the waiting area on a chair that was slightly too low, the kind of deliberate inconvenience that administrative spaces sometimes inflicted without meaning to. At 9:11, she was called in. Richard Thornfield was in his 50s, thin, with the specific energy of a man who had learned to frame everything as a process. He had paperwork on his desk and reading glasses in his hand, and he gestured to the chair across from him with the glasses instead of his hand, which told her something about how he thought of this meeting. Beside him, which she hadn't expected, was a woman she didn't recognize. Late 40s, good suit, the kind of compose that came from doing this kind of thing professionally. "Nora," Thornfield said. "Thanks for coming in. This is Sandra Keel. She's with our compliance office." Compliance, not HR, not legal. Compliance. "Good morning," Nora said. "We'll get right to it." He opened the folder in front of him. "We received a complaint yesterday evening regarding your nursing license. Specifically, a concern has been raised that your original licensing application may have contained a material omission." She kept her face still. "What kind of omission?" "The complaint alleges that you failed to disclose a prior military disciplinary action on your application." He looked at her over his glasses. "Is that accurate?" "The application asked whether I had any criminal convictions or civil judgments. I don't have either. A military administrative discharge is neither." "The application also has a general professional conduct disclosure," Keel said. Her voice was measured, practiced. "The concern is whether a conduct-related discharge falls within that disclosure requirement." "I consulted with a licensing advisor before I submitted my application," Nora said. "I was advised that an administrative discharge with a sealed record did not meet the disclosure threshold." "Do you have documentation of that consultation?" She looked at Keel steadily. "I'll need to check my records." "Of course." Thornfield closed the folder. "In the meantime, we're placing your active patient care duties on administrative hold, pending the licensing board's review." The words were so smooth they barely sounded like what they were. "You're suspending me," she said. "We're placing your duties on hold. It's a standard—" "How long?" "That depends on how quickly the licensing board can schedule a review." He set his glasses down. "We want to resolve this quickly, Nora. This isn't punitive, it's process." She looked at him, at Keel, at the folder on the desk with her name printed on the tab. "The complaint," she said. "When exactly was it filed?" Thornfield glanced at Keel briefly. Just a flicker. "We received it yesterday evening." "At what time?" Another small pause. "Shortly after 10 p.m. She had flagged Jalen's chart at 11:46. The surgical consult request went in at 12:09. The complaint had been filed before any of that happened. This wasn't about Wakefield. This wasn't about last night at all." "Thank you," she said. "I understand." She stood up, shook Thornfield's hand, shook Keel's hand, and walked out of the office and down the carpeted hallway and into the elevator and out through the hospital's main lobby, past the security desk, through the automatic doors, and into the cold morning air of Calverton, Oregon. She stood on the sidewalk. She breathed. Then she called Stull. They met at a diner on Ferris Street called Marta's that had been there since before the neighborhood around it changed and had the confidence of a place that didn't need to update its sign. Nora arrived first, took a booth in the back, and ordered coffee she didn't particularly want. Stoll came in 8 minutes later. He was smaller than his voice had suggested, compact, 60s, with a white mustache and the careful way of moving that people developed when their joints had stopped being reliable. He sat down across from her and didn't offer to shake hands, which she appreciated. He just looked at her for a moment, like he was confirming something. "You look like your file photo," he said. "Except the file photo smiles." The file photo was 7 years ago. "Fair enough." He signaled for coffee. "I'm going to tell you what I know, and then I'm going to stop talking and let you decide what to do with it. I'm not here to recruit you into anything. I'm not working an angle. I'm an old man with a clearance he's about to lose to retirement who has been looking at this particular file for 2 months and doesn't like what he sees." "Go ahead," she said. He wrapped both hands around the mug the server set down. "Dale Hargrove's promotion package is under review right now. 2-star consideration. The review board convenes in 11 weeks. He looked at the table. Routine background for a flag officer promotion includes a review of significant command decisions during their career. One of Hargrove's flag decisions was the conduct action he filed against you." He paused. The original reviewer marked it as low concern because the record was sealed and the subject, you, had been quiet. No complaints, no legal actions, no public statements. You'd essentially disappeared. "I had bills to pay," she said. He nodded like he understood that better than she might expect. "The issue is that the secondary audit, the one I mentioned on the phone, wasn't ordered by the review board. It was ordered by Hargrove's office. His staff submitted a request to have your record re-examined under what they called a clarification of historical conduct documentation." He said the phrase the way you said something that smelled wrong. "What that actually does is give them the ability to add supplementary documentation to the existing record, retroactively." She was quiet for a moment. "They want to strengthen the charge. They want to make sure that if anyone looks at it during the promotion review, what they see is airtight. No loose threads, no ambiguity." He looked at her. "You're a loose thread, Ms. Voss. Because I'm still alive and I still know what actually happened. Because you still have whatever you took with you." He said it carefully. "And before you tell me you don't know what I mean, the original investigation noted that certain communication logs from the operation had not been recovered from the unit's equipment, which was logged as equipment loss. But the investigator's handwritten notes, which I found in a box that should have been destroyed in 2019 but wasn't, suggested he believed the logs had been removed deliberately, by someone on the ground." He met her eyes. "The investigation assumed it was someone who wanted to hide misconduct. I think it was someone who wanted to preserve evidence." The diner was quiet around them. A couple in the front booth, a man at the counter with a newspaper, the server refilling something behind the coffee station. Nora looked at her hands on the table. "If Hargrove's people are trying to clean up the record," she said, "and I have documentation that contradicts the record, then you're not just a loose thread," Stoll said. "You're a problem they haven't solved yet." She thought about the complaint filed at 10 p.m., the meeting at 9, the efficiency of it, how fast it had moved, how cleanly it had landed. Administrative suspension while the licensing board reviewed a disclosure question. She'd be off active duty for weeks, minimum. No access to hospital resources, no visible platform, no professional standing to speak from. Just a nurse on administrative hold while a bureaucratic process ground along. "They're not trying to hurt me," she said slowly. "They're trying to contain me." "Yes. Keep me occupied with a process. Keep me from doing anything that looks like I'm engaging with the military record." A suspended nurse who starts making noise about a 7-year-old military discharge looks unstable at best, Stoll said. Vindictive at worst. Nobody listens. She picked up her coffee cup, put it down without drinking. Who else knows about the secondary audit? Inside Hargrove's chain? His staff and whoever they've brought in to run it. Outside of that, he paused. There's one name, a JAG officer at Fort Maris named Lieutenant Colonel Diana Reeves. She was assigned to the promotion review staff independently of Hargrove's office. She's the one who found the discrepancy between the original investigator's notes and the official record summary. She's also the reason the audit request didn't just sail through quietly. He reached into his jacket pocket and set a business card on the table. She's careful. She's not going to move on this without more than what she currently has. But she's looking. Nora looked at the card. Didn't pick it up yet. Haley, she said. Marcus Hale, former Ranger Regiment. You know him? I know of him. Good reputation. Why? He was there last night when I... She stopped. He recognized the medal. He knew the original charge was wrong. Stoll was quiet for a moment. He's not inside the investigation, but if he's willing to make a statement, he doesn't know the full picture yet. Neither do you, Stoll said. Not unkindly. Not all of it. She looked at him. What am I missing? He turned his coffee cup once, slowly. The operation you were on. The route that was compromised. He chose his words with visible care. The asset who provided the route coordinates was a source being run by a forward intelligence unit. The source's information was passed through a liaison officer before it reached your command element. I know that, she said. I never trusted the route. That's why The liaison officer who passed the coordinates, Stoll said, was a junior officer on Hargrove's staff. She stopped. He let it sit there. The route wasn't just compromised, she said. The route was passed along a chain that Hargrove controlled, Stoll said. I can't tell you whether Hargrove knew the source was bad. I can tell you that after the operation went wrong, the liaison officer received a commendation for operational support, and the source was never officially burned. He kept providing information to that unit for another 14 months. The couple in the front booth were laughing about something. The man at the counter turned a page of his newspaper. Outside, a delivery truck was backing up with that careful mechanical beeping. Nora sat very still. He didn't just want the charge to stick, she said. He needed me discredited, because if my refusal was ever examined properly, someone would ask what you knew about the route, Stoll said, and why you knew it. And the answer would lead back to his office. Stoll nodded once. She picked up the business card, turned it over. Reeves, Diana M., Lieutenant Colonel, J.A.G., a Fort Maris address and a direct line. The documentation I have, she said, the communication timestamps. If I could get someone to cross-reference them with the coordination logs from Hargrove's staff, it would show when the route coordinates were transmitted and through whose systems they moved. Stoll's voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it, the particular strain of a person who had been patient for a long time and was nearly at the edge of it. That's what the secondary audit is really trying to bury, not your conduct record. The coordination timeline. She put the card in her jacket pocket. She thought about the folder in the back of her cabinet, behind the cereal boxes. The handwritten timestamps, the photographs. The things she'd taken with her because she'd known, even in the hours after it all collapsed around her, that someday this moment would come. The moment when having the evidence and not having it would be the only difference that mattered. She'd just never been sure she'd survive long enough to reach it. I need 2 days, she said. To do what? To make copies of everything I have. To get them somewhere that isn't my apartment. She looked at him. And to talk to Hale. 2 days is probably fine, he paused. Probably. She heard the qualifier. What aren't you telling me? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that the server came by, refilled both cups without being asked, and left again. The secondary audit request has a timeline attached, Stoll said. They want it completed before the promotion review board convenes. 11 weeks, she said. 11 weeks is the outer limit. He looked at her steadily. But there's an interim briefing for the board in 3 weeks. And if the audit is completed before that briefing, they can submit the supplementary documentation during the interim, which closes the file, he said, before anyone can contest it. 3 weeks, not 11. 3. She sat with that for a moment. Let it rearrange the math she'd been doing in her head, the timeline she'd imagined, the careful process she'd thought she had room for. Okay, she said. 1 day. I need 1 day. She left the diner and was 2 blocks down the street, moving fast, when her phone rang again. Hale. Where are you? He said. Walking. Stop walking. I'm in the car behind you. She turned. A dark blue sedan parked half a block back. She hadn't noticed it. That bothered her more than it should have. She used to notice things like that automatically, without effort. She walked back to it, got in the passenger side. Ranger was in the back seat. He put his chin on her shoulder immediately, and she reached up and pressed her hand briefly against the side of his head. And it was only when she felt the warmth of it that she understood how cold she was. "Stoll told you about Reeves?" Hale said. "Yes. I know Reeves. We worked adjacent to each other at Fort Maris 3 years ago. She's solid. If she's looking at this, she's serious. She needs more than what she has." "Do you have more than what she has?" Nora looked out the windshield at the street ahead, at the ordinary Saturday morning traffic of a mid-sized Oregon city. A woman pushing a stroller, a man walking out of a hardware store with a flat of something under his arm. The regular visible surface of a day that had nothing to do with any of this. "Yes," she said. Hale put the car in drive. "Then we need to move," he said, "because I had Ranger check this morning while you were in that meeting, and the vet found a GPS tag on his harness that wasn't there yesterday." She turned and looked at the dog. Ranger looked back at her. "Someone put a tracker on your dog," she said. "Someone put a tracker on my dog," Hale confirmed, "which means someone knows where I've been, which means they know he sat down beside you in that pawn shop, which means they already know we've made contact," she said. He nodded. She turned back to the windshield. The 3 weeks she'd just been given had shrunk again. She could feel it, the timeline compressing, the space narrowing, the machinery that had been built to erase her clicking forward another gear. "Drive," she said. He drove west, away from the hospital district, through neighborhoods that got quieter as the morning traffic thinned out. Nora didn't ask where they were going. She was running calculations in her head. What she had, what she needed, what order things had to happen in, and how fast. The GPS tag on Ranger's harness was a small black disc, barely larger than a watch battery, tucked into the seam of the webbing near the left shoulder strap. Hale had found it because Ranger had been scratching at that spot since the night before, which was unusual enough that the vet had done a full harness check. Whoever planted it had done it cleanly. No adhesive residue, no disturbed stitching. Someone who knew working dog equipment. That narrowed things considerably. "When was the last time Ranger was out of your direct sight?" she said. "The ER waiting room. I left him with the intake coordinator while I went to fill out paperwork. Maybe 15 minutes. He paused. "There was a guy in the waiting area, sitting close to where Ranger was. I didn't think anything of it at the time. People always want to interact with him." "What did he look like?" "Medium build, dark jacket, maybe 50. He had a coffee from somewhere that wasn't the hospital cafeteria." Hale's voice was flat, the particular flatness of someone cataloging a failure. "I should have noticed that. If you brought outside food, you'd been waiting a while, or you knew you were going to be there." "Or both," she said. He pulled into the parking lot of a storage facility on the west side, the kind with individual roll-up units, an access keypad, no attendant on weekends. He had a unit here. He'd had it for 3 years, he told her, left over from a move he'd never fully completed. The stuff inside was mostly boxes of things he hadn't needed enough to unpack but hadn't been willing to throw away. It was also, she gathered, a place nobody knew about except him. She appreciated that without saying so. The unit was 10 by 12, temperature-controlled, and smelled like cardboard and dust. He pulled a folding table from behind a stack of boxes and set it up under the fluorescent light, and she sat down on an overturned plastic bin and started talking. She told him about the operation the way she hadn't told anyone in 7 years, not because she'd forgotten it, but because there had been nobody worth telling and nowhere to tell it that would have mattered. She'd held it the way you held something that was too important to set down and too heavy to carry comfortably, and now she set it on the table between them and let it be what it was. The unit had been a joint reconnaissance element, she said. 6 people. Her as the attached medic. Their job was to confirm a target location before a larger action moved in. The route to the observation point had been issued through the battalion intelligence chain. Coordinates, timing, checkpoints. Standard. She'd looked at the route and something had been wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not wrong in a way she could have written a formal objection to. Just a quality of wrongness she'd developed over 3 deployments. A feeling that lived below the level of articulable logic, that the route's third segment passed through a terrain feature that people who actually knew that ground wouldn't have chosen. She'd raised it with the mission commander. He'd told her to trust the intel. She'd asked to see the source assessment on the coordinates. She'd been told it wasn't her clearance level. They'd moved out at 0200. At the third checkpoint, she'd stopped the element. Just stopped them. Said she needed 60 seconds. The mission commander had been furious. She'd had 60 seconds of absolute certainty, the kind that didn't explain itself, that either saved your life or ended your career, and she'd called the abort and moved the element laterally, 200 meters off the planned route, into a drainage depression that gave them cover. 4 minutes later, the position they would have been standing in lit up. Not a random engagement, a prepared position. Someone had known exactly where they would be and when. She'd gotten everyone out. All 6. The mission was compromised and the target was lost, and the formal after-action had characterized her abort call as unauthorized deviation from the mission plan, which it was, technically. Hargrove had filed the conduct charge within a week. The investigation was fast and quiet, and the record was sealed before most people in her unit even understood what had happened. 6 people, Hale said. 6 people. And Hargrove filed a conduct charge instead of recommending you for a commendation. The commendation would have required an explanation, she said. The explanation would have led to questions about the route. The questions about the route would have led to whoever issued the bad coordinates. She looked at the wall of the storage unit. He had to make the abort look like the problem, not the ambush. Hale was quiet for a moment. The other 5, your element, what happened to them? Separated, reassigned. 2 of them got out of the Army within 18 months. She paused. I've been in contact with one of them, intermittently. His name is Dwight Farrow. He's in Portland now. He's the one who told me 2 years ago that someone had tried to access our unit's communication records. Hale's head came up. Accessed how? A request went through the records management system at the unit's parent command. It was framed as a historical archive review. The request was flagged by a clerk who noticed the timing. It came in right before a cycle of record purges, which meant anything pulled for review might not get refiled correctly. She held his gaze. Farrow knew the clerk. The clerk told him. By the time either of them understood what it meant, the request had already been processed, and the records were marked for transfer. But they weren't completely transferred. The transfer request specified certain date ranges. The clerk noticed the specified range stopped 2 days before the operation. The communication logs from the operation itself weren't included. She paused. Either the person who filed the request didn't know the exact date of the operation, or they were being careful not to look like they were specifically targeting those records. So the logs might still exist. The logs still exist, she said, or they did 2 years ago. I don't know what's happened since. She reached into the bag and pulled out the folder. She'd stopped at her apartment on the way. 3 minutes, in and out, while Hale stayed in the car and watched the street, and gotten the things she needed. She spread them on the table. The handwritten timeline. The photographs. 4 of them, taken in the hours after the abort, showing the terrain they'd crossed and the position that had been targeted. The communication timestamp she'd written from memory that first night home. And one more thing she hadn't described to anyone yet. A folded sheet of paper, worn soft at the creases, that she'd kept inside the lining of the bag for 7 years. She unfolded it carefully. A handwritten sequence of alphanumeric codes, frequency identifiers, transmission windows, originating node designations. Hale looked at it. Is that the routing headers from 2 transmissions I intercepted the night before the operation, she said. I had monitoring equipment. I was supposed to use it to track friendly movement frequencies, but I was picking up traffic on an adjacent band and I wrote down what I saw because the originating node designator didn't match anything in our issued frequency plan. He looked at the codes. You'd need someone with current signals intelligence access to trace these. I'd need someone with signals intelligence access and the ability to cross-reference them against Hargrove's staff communication records from that period, she said, which is exactly what Reeves would need to build a case. She pulled out the business card Stoll had given her and set it next to the folded sheet. I need to get this to Reeves, she said. Physically, not electronically. I don't know which systems are being monitored, and I'm not going to risk... Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Pharaoh. She answered immediately. Dwight. Nora. His voice was tight. I've been trying you since last night. Where are you? Safe. What's wrong? I got a visitor yesterday afternoon. A man came to my house, said he was doing a routine follow-up on a records matter and wanted to ask me some questions about our old unit. She went still. What kind of questions? About the operation. About what happened on the abort. He was framing it like a historical review, say, casualty documentation, that kind of language. A pause. He asked me specifically if I'd been in contact with you recently. What did you tell him? I told him we weren't in touch, which was true at that point. Another pause, shorter, more strained. Nora, the guy had a DOD contractor ID, not military, contractor, and the last name on the ID. I didn't think about it until he left, but I've seen that name before. Henwick. There was a Henwick on the liaison staff during our deployment, junior officer. The name landed in her chest like something physical. Hale was watching her face. Dwight, she said carefully, are you at home right now? Yes. Is anyone else there? My wife. The kids are at her mother's for the weekend. Okay, I need you to write down a number. She gave him Stoll's number. Call that man. His name is Warren Stoll. Tell him everything you told me and tell him I sent you. Don't use your personal phone after this call. Borrow your wife's or go buy a prepaid. She thought for a second. And Dwight, the thing you told me 2 years ago. The clerk who flagged the records request. Do you still have a way to reach them? A long pause. Maybe. Find out if they kept any documentation of that request, anything at all, even just a note. She heard him breathing. Can you do that? Yeah, he said. Yeah, I can do that. She hung up, looked at Hale. The liaison officer who passed the route coordinates, she said. Stoll didn't give me a name. He said it was a junior officer on Hargrove's staff. Henwick? Hale said. A contractor ID with that name showed up at my former teammate's house yesterday, the day after I walked into a pawn shop with those medals. She folded the sheet of codes and put it back in her bag. They weren't just trying to clean up Hargrove's promotion file. They were tracking anyone who might still have information. Pharaoh? Me? She stopped. If they knew about Pharaoh, they might know about the clerk. Hale pulled out his own phone. I'm calling Reeves, he said. We can't wait another day. We don't have the documentation in a form she can act on yet. If I walk in there with handwritten notes and photographs from a disposable camera, you walk in there with an eyewitness from the operation, a retired CID officer, a set of communication frequency codes that can be independently verified, and a contractor showing up at people's doors doing intimidation field work the day after your name presumably got flagged. He was already dialing. That's not nothing, Nora. That's a pattern. Reeves can work with a pattern. She listened to him speak. He was concise and careful, the way people were when they'd had years of practice at briefing things quickly. He gave Reeves the shape of it without the specifics. Former element member, classified operation, conduct record under secondary audit by the subject of a promotion review, active contractor contact with a witness, documentation in hand. She heard Reeves's voice on the other end but couldn't make out words. Hale listened, said, How soon? Listened again, said, Understood. Hung up. She wants to meet today, he said. Not Fort Maris. She's coming to Calverton. She has a 4-hour drive. She'll come to us? She said she'd been waiting for someone to give her a reason to make that drive. He pocketed the phone. 4 hours. We need to organize what you have into something she can follow. And we need to find somewhere to be that isn't this storage unit and isn't your apartment. They spent the next 3 hours at a motel off Route 9 that asked for cash and didn't appear to have working hallway cameras, which Hale had identified with a methodical sweep that he performed so naturally it took her a moment to register he was doing it. She organized the documentation at the small desk while he sat on the bed with his laptop and began pulling together what he could from open-source military records. Hargrove's public career profile, the promotion announcement timelines, the publicly listed staff assignments from the relevant deployment period. Ranger slept on the floor between them, occasionally shifting positions with a sigh of someone completing a task. The organization of evidence was its own kind of work, not just the sorting, but the sequencing. the building of a narrative that moved in a straight enough line for someone coming to it cold to follow. She wrote a clean timeline, typed on Hale's laptop, that ran from the issuance of the route coordinates through the operation, the abort, the after action, and the conduct charge, with her documented evidence mapped against each event. She kept the language flat. No adjectives where she could avoid them. Dates, times, identifiers, observable facts. The photographs were a problem. 4 images from a disposable camera developed at a drugstore in the weeks after she got home, slightly soft at the edges, shot in the uncertain light of a post-operation morning. They showed what they showed. She wrote a caption for each one that described exactly what was visible and why it was relevant. She didn't editorialize. At 2:14 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, a different number from Stoll's. But the message started with a code word she'd given Pharaoh to use if he needed to relay through someone else. The text said, "Clerk confirmed. Request documentation exists. Physical copy held off-site. Clerk willing to provide." She stared at that for a moment. A physical copy of the records access request, showing what date range had been specified, what system it had been routed through, and whose authorization it had carried. If that document showed Henwick's name, or any name traceable to Hargrove's staff, the pattern stopped being a pattern and became a provable chain. She showed Hale. He read it and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Where is the clerk now?" he said. "I don't know. Pharaoh would." "Get Pharaoh to find out, and get Stoll to arrange someone to accompany the clerk when they bring the document." He paused. "Not us. Someone withstanding. Stoll will know who." She relayed that through the same channel. Got back a confirmation message in under 4 minutes, which told her Stoll had been ready for something like this. At 3:47, Reeves knocked on the door. She was exactly what her name sounded like on a business card. Precise, put together, the kind of officer who had learned that the best way to be taken seriously in rooms that didn't want to take her seriously was to be 5 times more prepared than anyone else in the room. She was 46 or so, with close-cropped natural hair and the reading glasses that lived permanently on top of her head, never actually on her nose unless she was reading something. She came in, shook hands, looked at the documentation on the desk, and sat down. She didn't waste time. "Walk me through it from the top," she said. "Everything." Nora walked her through it. Reeves listened without interrupting, which was itself a skill. She made notes in a narrow-ruled notebook with a pen she clicked methodically at transition points between topics. When Nora finished, Reeves looked at the documentation for a long moment, then looked up. "The frequency codes," she said. "Do you know if those node designators were ever assigned to a specific unit or command element?" "I don't have the technical resources to trace them. That's what I need." "I can submit a signals records request," Reeves said slowly, "but it goes through channels that Hargrove's office might be monitoring, particularly if they're already watching traffic related to his record." She pressed her lips together. "I need to route it through someone outside the standard chain." "Can you do that?" "I know someone at DIA who owes me a professional debt." She said it without pride, just fact. "It'll take time I'm not sure we have." "The interim briefing," Nora said. 3 weeks. "Correct. And if the supplementary audit documentation goes into Hargrove's promotion file before the interim briefing?" Reeves shook her head. "Reopening a flag officer's promotion package after the board's interim review is not impossible, but it requires a level of institutional will that is hard to generate," Hale said. "Hard to generate quickly," Reeves said. "Yes." She looked at the photographs, the timeline, the handwritten frequency codes. "This is strong," she said. "This is genuinely strong. But right now it's one person's documentation and recollection, supported by one eyewitness account and one records flag that may or may not produce a physical document." She looked at Nora steadily. "I need the frequency trace, and I need the records request document from that clerk. Both of those are in motion," Hale said. "Then I need them to arrive before I do anything official." She closed her notebook. "I also need to tell you that filing a formal inquiry into a general officer's promotion package based on allegations related to a 7-year-old conduct charge will create attention. Once I submit, I can't unsubmit. Every person in Hargrove's network who is watching this situation will know within 24 hours that a JAG inquiry has been opened. Which means Henwick and anyone working alongside him will know we've surfaced, Nora said. Yes. She sat with that. The implications of it. The specific way that moving forward committed you to a speed you didn't fully control. Once you were visible, the other side responded, and their response was its own kind of clock. I understand the risk, she said. I want to make sure you do, Reeves said. Not unkindly, because what they did to you administratively with the nursing license took less than 12 hours from trigger to action. If they know you're actively providing documentation to a JAG inquiry, they'll come at me from another angle, Nora said. They have resources, Reeves said simply, and they've had 7 years to develop patience. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a truck passed on the highway. Ranger lifted his head from the floor, assessed the sound, put his head back down. What would you do? Nora said. Reeves looked at her. Honestly? Yes. I'd wait for the records document from the clerk. 24 hours, maybe less if Stoll moves fast. The frequency trace will take longer, but I can start it in parallel. She paused. What I wouldn't do is wait at this motel. If they've tracked Hale's dog and visited your former teammate, you should assume they know your approximate location through some method you haven't identified yet. You think we should move. I think you should be somewhere you have more control over who knows where you are. She said it practically, without drama, which made it land harder than drama would have. Nora folded the timeline and put it in her bag alongside the photographs and the frequency codes. Hale was already packing his laptop. Reeves stood, checked her notebook was in her jacket. One more thing, Reeves said. The 5 other members of your element. You mentioned one, Pharaoh. The others? Scattered, Nora said. I've lost track of 2 of them entirely. The other 2? She paused. One of them, a man named Terrence Galt, was in a car accident 14 months after his discharge. It was investigated as an accident. He survived, but he's had 2 spinal surgeries and he's not in a position to... I'm not asking them to do anything, Reeves said. I just need to know if there are other people in this picture who might be approached, who might need to be aware. Nora hadn't thought about it that way. She'd been thinking about evidence. She hadn't fully extended the logic of what Henwick's visit to Pharaoh meant, that this wasn't just about cleaning up a record, it was about mapping who knew what and making sure none of them moved at the wrong time. I'll reach out, she said. They left the room in the order Hale specified. Reeves first, 5 minutes, then Hale and Nora from the back exit. It was professional and slightly grim and completely necessary. They were in the car, Ranger in the back again, heading north on Route 9, when Nora's phone lit up. Not a call. A notification from the hospital's employee portal, which she was still able to access because the IT department hadn't finished processing her administrative hold paperwork yet. She looked at it. An internal incident report had been filed. Patient name, Jalen Reyes. Surgical complication notation. The report was flagged for nursing review, specifically citing the nursing staff member who had initiated the unauthorized surgical consult. Her name was in the report. She read further. The complication notation wasn't about Jalen's surgical outcome. He'd done well. The surgeon's notes confirmed that. The complication notation was a separate administrative flag, added to the chart by someone in the compliance office. It cited the surgical consult as having been initiated outside the attending physician's order set, creating potential liability exposure for the hospital. The attending physician of record on the consult order was listed as Wakefield. Wakefield hadn't ordered the consult. She had. But the record had been amended to show that the consult originated from his order set, with her name attached as the initiating nurse acting on physician instruction, which meant that if this report moved forward, it wouldn't look like she'd gone around a doctor to get a patient the care he needed. It would look like she'd improperly attributed a clinical decision to a physician who hadn't made it, which was falsification of medical records. That was a criminal matter, not an administrative one. Her hands were very steady, which was the thing that happened when the fear went past a certain point and became something else, a cold clarity that didn't have room in it for shaking. She showed the phone to Hale. He read it, said nothing for a long moment. "They're not containing you anymore," she said. He kept his eyes on the road. "No," he said. "They're not." She called Stoll from the car. He answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting near his phone, which meant he already knew something had shifted. They amended a patient chart, she said. Attach my name to a clinical decision in a way that looks like falsification. It went into the system tonight. A beat of silence. How long ago? The timestamp is 4:22 p.m. I saw it at 5:09. So they moved while you were meeting with Reeves. He said it slowly, working out the same math she'd already done. Either they have someone watching hospital system activity, or the meeting location wasn't clean, Hale said from the driver's seat, loud enough for the phone to catch. Who is that? Hale, she said. He's right. Reeves came from Fort Maris, 4-hour drive. If anyone flagged her vehicle leaving post, she uses a personal car for sensitive movement, Stoll said. I know because I asked her once. She's careful. Careful isn't invisible, Hale said. Stoll was quiet for a moment. Where are you now? Route 9, heading north. We haven't decided on a destination yet. There's a location I use in Delmore. It's a house, belongs to my brother-in-law. He's in Arizona until March. I've used it before for exactly this kind of situation. He gave her an address. Give me 2 hours to make sure it's ready. Don't use navigation to get there. I'll text you turn by turn. She relayed the address to Hale with her hand over the phone. He nodded. Stoll, she said. The chart amendment. Is that something Reeves can use? If it was entered into a medical record system by someone who doesn't have legitimate clinical standing to make that entry? Yes. That's tampering with a legal document. That's a different category from anything they've done so far. He paused. It's also desperate. You don't touch patient records unless you're running out of cleaner options. They're accelerating, she said. They're accelerating, he confirmed, which means something we did today scared them. She thought about what had happened today. Farrow's contact, the clerk's document, Reeves driving 4 hours to look at handwritten frequency codes. Individually, none of those things were visible to Hargrove's network, but something had moved, and the movement had registered somewhere, and the response had come within hours. The records access request, she said. Stoll, when Farrow reached out to the clerk, what method did they use? A pause that was slightly too long. Phone. Farrow's wife's phone. Which wasn't a secure line. Another pause. No. She looked out the windshield at the darkening road ahead. Someone was monitoring Farrow's household. After Henwick's visit, they put coverage on his contact activity. When the call went to the clerk, they knew. Then they knew someone was moving toward the records documentation. And they responded by making the medical records issue criminal before we could get ahead of it. She let out a slow breath. It's smart. If I'm facing a criminal inquiry into chart falsification, anything I say about a 7-year-old military conduct charge looks like deflection, like I'm manufacturing a larger story to escape a smaller one, Stoll said. Then we need the clerk's document in Reeves's hands before the criminal complaint gets filed formally. Right now it's an internal hospital report. How fast can they convert that to a formal complaint? If they have someone in the compliance office moving it, 48 hours. Maybe less. Then we have tonight, he said. Quinta. The clerk's name was Yolanda Marsh. She was 41, currently working records management for a private healthcare logistics company in Salem, and she had kept the documentation for 3 years in a waterproof envelope inside a locked filing cabinet in her spare bedroom, not because she'd been certain she'd ever need it, but because she'd been raised in a household where you kept paper on things that felt wrong. Her mother had worked in insurance adjusting. It had made Yolanda pathologically thorough. She drove to Delmore herself. Stoll had offered to send someone, but she'd declined, said she'd rather be moving than sitting still. She arrived at the house at 8:30, parked in the attached garage per Stoll's instructions, and came inside with a canvas grocery bag over one arm that contained the waterproof envelope and a pound cake she'd baked that afternoon because she didn't know what else to do with her hands while she waited. Nora hadn't expected the pound cake. It sat on the kitchen counter and nobody ate it, but it was there, and there was something steadying about that. The ordinary domestic weight of a person who baked things when they were scared. Yolanda Marsh was a small woman with a direct way of talking and a watchfulness around the eyes that came from years of processing other people's errors and being ignored when she flagged them. She sat at the kitchen table across from Nora and Stoll and put the envelope between them. "I want to know what happens to me," she said, "before I give you anything. I want to know what my exposure looks like." "You flagged an irregularity and retained a copy of a document generated within your professional scope," Stoll said. "That's not whistleblowing in the legal sense, it's records management practice." "I retained a copy without authorization." "You retained it as personal documentation of a professional concern you weren't sure would be acted on." He looked at her steadily. "I've seen cases built on this kind of retention. You're in a much better position than you think." She looked at Nora. "What are they going to do to you?" "They've amended a patient's medical chart with my name attached to a decision I didn't make," Nora said. "If they push it to a formal complaint, I'm looking at a criminal charge for falsification of medical records." Yolanda Marsh looked at the envelope for a moment. Then she opened it. The document was 3 pages. The first was the original records access request form, system generated with the requesting party's information, the authorization code, the specified date range. The second was a routing slip showing which systems the request had passed through. The third was Yolanda's own handwritten notation, dated and signed, describing the irregularity she'd observed. The requesting party's information on the first page listed an authorization code that mapped to a contractor account rather than a direct military account. The account designation included a prefix that Nora didn't recognize, but Stoll did. She saw it in his face before he said anything. "That's a support contractor account registered to a DoD-adjacent private firm," he said. He looked at Nora. "Not a military account. Civilian contractor. Which means whoever filed this request was attempting to access military records through a civilian channel to avoid leaving a military footprint in the system." "Is that traceable?" Hale said. "The account number is traceable. It will take time, and it requires access to contractor registration records. But yes." He pulled out his phone. "I know someone at the contractor oversight office." He looked at the time. "It's almost 9. I'm going to call anyway." He went into the next room. Yolanda Marsh sat with her hands folded on the table, watching Nora the way people watched someone when they were deciding how much to say. "The date range on the request," Nora said. "The one that stopped 2 days before the operation. I noticed it because we'd been processing a batch of archive requests that week, and they all had clean date ranges. Round numbers, full quarters, that kind of thing. This one ended on a specific date mid-month, which isn't common unless you're requesting records around a specific event." She paused. "I looked at the calendar. That date was a Thursday. 2 days before your operation was Saturday," Nora said. "Saturday. So they wanted everything up to Thursday, but not the Saturday." She looked at her hands. "I don't know what happened on that Saturday, but I knew enough to know somebody didn't want it in the pull." "They were trying to get context without getting evidence," Hale said from the counter where he'd been standing. "They wanted to see what the records contained up to the point they were managing," Nora said. "Make sure there was nothing unexpected in the lead-up. But pulling the operation records themselves would have created too obvious a trail." She looked at the form again, at the specified date range, at the contractor account number, at the routing slip showing the path through the system. This was the thread Reeves had said she needed. Not the whole rope, not yet, but a thread with a traceable end. She photographed all 3 pages on her phone, sent them to Reeves with a message that said only, "Records request doc, civilian contractor account. Call when received." Her phone showed delivered at 9:17 p.m. Reeves called at 9:24. "The contractor account prefix," Reeves said. "I've seen that prefix before. Twice, in unrelated cases. Both times it traced to a firm called Daltrey Operational Services. They do support contracting for several commands." A pause. "One of the commands they've worked with in the last 3 years is Hargrove's current posting." The kitchen went very quiet. "Can you put that in front of the signals trace?" Nora said. "If the DIA contact comes back with a node match on those frequency codes, and I expect by tomorrow morning, then yes. I have a contractor account accessing military records through an irregular channel, a frequency trace showing unauthorized transmission through a staff element linked to that contractor, and a conduct charge filed by the officer who ran that staff element." Reeves's voice was controlled, But underneath it was something that sounded almost like the relief of someone who had been holding a shape together under pressure and could finally feel it holding on its own. That's a pattern I can take somewhere. How soon can you file? I need the signals trace confirmed. Assuming that happens by tomorrow morning, I can have a preliminary inquiry submission to the Inspector General's office by end of day tomorrow. And the medical records amendment, the chart issue? Forward me the documentation of that. What they did with that patient chart is obstruction of a federal witness if I've already filed by the time they try to use it. Another pause. Which is one more reason to file quickly. After she hung up, the kitchen stayed quiet for a moment. Stoll came back from the other room. The contractor account, he said. My contact confirmed it in under 10 minutes. The account is registered to Daltrey Operational Services. Active status. The account has been used for 3 records access requests in the past 2 years. All 3 targeted personnel files or communication records associated with your former unit. 3 requests. Not 1. They'd been at this for 2 years at minimum, working through a contractor layer to stay off the direct military records grid, pulling files on everyone connected to that operation, identifying loose threads and then methodically addressing them. Galt's car accident was 14 months after discharge, she thought. She hadn't said that out loud, but she felt it now, the way you felt something in a dark room. Not seeing it clearly, but certain it was there. Galt, she said. Terrence Galt. The car accident. Stoll looked at her. He understood what she was implying without her having to complete the sentence. He wrote the name down. I'll look at the accident report, he said quietly. Yolanda Marsh left at 10:15, taking her pound cake with her, after Stoll had walked her through exactly what she'd need to do in the next 48 hours and what to say if anyone contacted her. She looked steadier than when she'd arrived. People often did, Nora had noticed, once they stopped carrying something alone. The 3 of them, Nora, Hale, Stoll, sat at the kitchen table with the remaining documentation spread between them. Ranger had settled in the corner with his head on his paws. The house smelled like someone else's life. Wood polish, old wool rug, the faint background of a space that was usually empty. Stoll looked at the handwritten timeline Nora had built. You should sleep, he said. Both of you. I'll stay up for the DIA contact. I'm not going to sleep, she said. You should try. She looked at the timeline, at the photographs, at the sequence of things that had been done to her over 7 years, carefully and systematically, by people who had assumed she would eventually stop being a problem. They went after the clerk, she said. If they were monitoring Pharaoh's household calls. I've moved the clerk to a contact in Salem, I trust, Stoll said. She's not alone. And Pharaoh? His wife drove them to her mother's place tonight, same place the kids were already staying. He looked at Nora steadily. I've been doing this for a long time. I know how to move people. She believed him, and she was grateful for it in the unsentimental way you were grateful for something that kept you from having to hold everything yourself. She didn't sleep. She lay down in the back bedroom for 2 hours with her eyes closed and let her body rest, if not her mind, which ran through the evidence chain like a process she was checking for breaks. There were still gaps. The signals trace was the critical one. Without it, the contractor account was suggestive but not conclusive, a brick without mortar. If the DIA contact came back negative or came back inconclusive, Reeves would have less than she needed to move confidently, and Hargrove's network had shown they could move in hours. At 1:30 a.m., she came back to the kitchen. Stoll was at the table with his laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and a second notepad that had things on it she hadn't seen him write. Something came back, she said. It wasn't a question. 30 minutes ago. He turned the laptop to face her. The DIA contact pulled the node designators from your frequency codes. 2 of the 3 traced to equipment registered to a field support element that was attached to Hargrove's staff during the relevant deployment period. The 3rd designator is older. It traces to a predecessor unit, which is consistent with equipment that was carried over between rotations without being re-registered. He paused. The transmission windows you wrote down match a period when your unit's operations log shows no scheduled communication activity. There was no friendly traffic on those frequencies during those windows. The transmissions didn't come from your element. She looked at the screen, at the technical language that translated, finally, into something irrefutable. Signals that had moved through equipment on Hargrove's side of the command structure, in windows that weren't accounted for, The night before an operation that went wrong in exactly the way that information could have made possible. They were communicating with someone outside the command, she said. Someone outside the command and outside the country based on the signal directionality data my contact included. Stoll's voice was measured. I'm not going to speculate further than the data supports, but the transmission pattern is consistent with outbound contact, and the timing is consistent with the operation's route information having been passed. She sat down. It was one thing to have known. To have known for 7 years, in the way you knew something that had no form yet. Just wait. It was another thing to see it laid out in frequency data and timestamp tables and the technical language of signals intelligence. They had sent her team into that position knowing what was waiting. She'd aborted because her body had known before her mind did, and they'd charged her for it because the charge was the only way to prevent the question of why the route had failed from ever being asked officially. Forward this to Reeves, she said. Her voice came out even. She didn't know why she was surprised by that. Stoll sent it at 1:47 a.m. Reeves replied at 2:03 a.m. with 4 words. Filing at 0800. Stand by. She was standing by at 7:30, coffee in hand, when Hale's phone rang. He looked at the screen, answered, listened for 45 seconds without speaking, and hung up. The hospital, he said. The internal incident report on the chart amendment was submitted to the state licensing board last night. Someone moved it out of internal compliance and escalated it externally. He looked at her. They filed it at 11:52 p.m. After Reeves had confirmed she was filing, after someone in Hargrove's network had learned, through some channel she still hadn't identified, that an IG inquiry was coming. They'd rushed the licensing board submission to get the criminal framing in place before the military inquiry could establish her as a protected federal witness. It was a race she was in whether she'd agreed to run or not. Can Reeves's filing preempt it? She said. I don't know, Hale said honestly. It depends on timing and jurisdiction and which body. I need to call her. She called Reeves. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She texted instead. Licensing board submission filed 11:52 p.m. Criminal framing. Does your 0800 filing protect me? She waited. Watched the screen. At 7:51, Reeves called back. I saw your text, Reeves said. The licensing board submission creates a problem. If they framed it as falsification of a medical record, that's a state criminal matter. My filing is federal. Technically, the federal inquiry doesn't automatically halt a state proceeding. Nora was quiet. However, Reeves said, if I include the chart amendment in my filing as an act of obstruction against a federal investigation, and I can make that argument, it becomes a matter for federal jurisdiction, which supersedes. Can you include it in the filing at 800? I was already planning to. She paused. But, Nora, I need you to understand something. Once I file, Hargrove's legal team is going to be notified. They will challenge the jurisdiction argument. It will be contested. There will be a period, days, possibly a week or more, where you are technically still under the licensing board's process while the jurisdictional question is being resolved. What does that mean practically? It means you may be formally charged at the state level before the federal filing can halt the process. A pause. It won't stick. If the federal case holds, the state matter gets set aside. But it will happen. You need to be prepared for that. She thought about being prepared for that. What that looked like. What it cost. I understand, she said. There's one more thing, Reeves said. When the filing goes in this morning, there's a standard notification process for the subject of the inquiry. Hargrove will be informed that a preliminary IG inquiry has been opened related to his promotion package. Another pause, shorter, carrying a different kind of weight. He won't know the full scope immediately, but he'll know something is moving. How does he typically respond to that kind of notification? I don't know him personally, Reeves's voice was careful, but in my experience, when senior officers receive IG inquiry notifications that they know are substantive, they have 2 options. They can cooperate and control the narrative, or they can move to discredit the source before the inquiry establishes standing. She'd been the source for 7 years. She knew what that looked like. He'll come at me, she said. Probably, and quickly. Reeves let a beat of silence pass. Is there anything about your life in the last 7 years? Anything at all that he could characterize as instability, misconduct, or a pattern of conflict with authority. She thought about it. The honest version, not the defensive one. She'd had one formal complaint at her previous hospital in Portland before Hale Orthopedic. A dispute with a supervising physician over a pain management protocol she'd believed was inadequate. She'd filed her own counter-complaint. It had been resolved without discipline on either side, but it existed in the record. She told Reeves. "That's manageable," Reeves said. "One dispute, mutual, resolved, not a pattern." She paused. "Anything else?" "No criminal record, no financial judgments. One eviction from 4 years ago. I was 2 weeks late on rent during a gap between jobs." "That won't matter." "Then no," Nora said. "There's nothing else." After she hung up, she sat with that exchange for a moment. Not the legal content of it, the other part. The part where she'd had to run an inventory of her own life looking for weaknesses they could use against her. It was a particular kind of exposure doing that, like being asked to hold still while someone looked for the worst-case version of you. Hale had been standing in the doorway during the call. He'd heard enough. "For what it's worth," he said, "the person I've watched operate over the last 24 hours, the one who caught the chart amendment, organized the evidence, kept Farrow calm, read the room with Stoll and Reeves, that's not someone with a pattern of instability." She looked at him. "You've known me for 36 hours. "I've known the type for 22 years, he said. "That counts for something." She didn't answer that, but she held it somewhere. At 8:07 a.m., Reeves's filing reached the Inspector General's office. At 8:19, Stool received a confirmation that the submission had been received and assigned a case number. At 8:34, Hargrove's legal representative sent a response to the IG office challenging the basis of the inquiry, which meant Hargrove had been notified and had had legal representation standing by, ready to respond in under 30 minutes. He'd known it was coming. Not the specifics, but he'd known something was coming, and he'd had people in position. The 8:34 response had one more element that Stoll relayed to them at 8:41, reading directly from what Reeves had forwarded him. Hargrove's legal representative had submitted, alongside the challenge, a character and conduct reference package for Hargrove, standard practice when fighting an IG inquiry. The package included statements from fellow officers, a service history summary, and a supplementary document. The supplementary document was a second declaration, signed by someone at the hospital, characterizing Nora Voss as a disruptive employee with a documented history of circumventing medical authority. The signatory wasn't Thornfield. It was Wakefield. The second-year resident who'd told her she was just a nurse and then had his name attached to her unauthorized consult. The one who had, she'd assumed, been a bystander to what was done to the chart rather than a participant in it. She looked at his name on the document Stoll had handed her, printed from the forwarded email. Wakefield, 29 years old, second year of residency. The kind of person who didn't have the connections to move a licensing complaint in 12 hours on his own. The kind of person who needed someone to hand him the language and tell him where to sign. Someone had been in contact with Wakefield before last night. Maybe before the shift when she'd flagged Jalen's chart at all. "They had him positioned," she said. Stoll nodded. "Before the pawn shop," she said. "Before Ranger. They already knew enough about my work situation to have a contact inside that hospital." "They've been building the civilian case alongside the military record cleanup," Stoll said. "You were never just a loose thread. You were an active contingency they were managing." She set the document down on the table, looked at Wakefield's signature, thought about him in that hallway saying, "You're a nurse," Voss with the tired certainty of someone who believed the sentence was sufficient. Maybe he had believed it. Maybe they'd found him because he already believed it, and all they'd had to do was hand him a form. It didn't change what it was. "Reeves needs to know about Wakefield," she said. "I've already sent it," Stoll said. Her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered anyway because she'd stopped having the luxury of not answering numbers she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was male, unhurried, with the particular accent of someone who'd grown up in the mid-Atlantic region and spent years filing it smooth. "Ms. Voss," the voice said. My name is Gerald Fitch. I'm calling on behalf of General Hargrove. I'd like to discuss a resolution to the current situation that benefits everyone involved." She looked at Stoll, mouthed the name. His expression didn't change, but his eyes went very sharp. He held up one finger, but wait, and started typing on his laptop. "I'm listening," she said. "The general is aware that you've been through a difficult period," Fitch said. "He's also aware that some of the decisions made around the time of your discharge may not have been handled with the care they deserved. He's prepared to support a formal review of your discharge record, a correction of the relevant documentation, and a statement from his office acknowledging that the conduct charge was, let's say, not necessary given the circumstances." She kept her voice neutral. In exchange for what? A pause that was calibrated to sound thoughtful rather than what it was. "In exchange for your cooperation with the withdrawal of the IG inquiry materials you've submitted." He paused again. "And a mutual agreement that the events of the operation in question remain within the existing classification framework." She listened to the ambient sound of the kitchen, the refrigerator's hum, Hale's breathing, Ranger shifting his weight in the corner. "He wants me to withdraw the evidence," she said. "He wants this to reach a quiet resolution," Fitch said. "For everyone." She looked at Stoll, who had turned his laptop to face her. On the screen was a name, Gerald Fitch, and beside it a firm name, Daltrey Operational Services. Hargrove's legal representative was the same firm as the contractor account that had accessed military records for 2 years, the same firm as Henwick. He hadn't sent a lawyer. He'd sent the operation. "Mr. Fitch," she said, I'm going to need some time to consider that." "Of course," he said smoothly. "I'll call back in 2 hours." She hung up. The kitchen was absolutely still. "He knows the filing went in," she said, "and instead of fighting it through the IG process, he's offering a deal, which means—" "He doesn't think he can win the IG process," Stoll said. "Or he can't afford the time it takes," Hale said. "The interim board briefing is in under 3 weeks. Even if he ultimately beats the inquiry, if it's still open during the interim briefing, his promotion gets delayed," Stoll said, "which in his world is worse than the inquiry itself." She stood up, walked to the window. The morning outside was gray and flat, the yard behind the house showing the pressed-down dead grass of a winter that had been hard on everything. "If I accept the deal," she said, "the operation stays buried. The route compromise. Whoever was on the other end of those transmissions, whatever Galt's accident actually was." She turned around. "The 5 people who were on that ground with me stay in the position they're in. Farrow still gets visits. The clerk keeps her envelope." "Yes," Stoll said, "and if I don't accept it, they fight the inquiry through every channel they have. They push the licensing board process, they use Wakefield's statement, they find whatever else they can find." He looked at her evenly. "It gets harder before it gets easier." She nodded slowly. "Fitch is calling back in 2 hours," she said. "I want Reeves on the phone before then, and I want someone to call Farrow and tell him what's happening." "Done," Stoll said. He was already picking up his phone. She looked at Hale. "You knew," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of something he'd understood before she'd said it. "I knew what the offer was going to look like before he finished the first sentence," she said. "I've been waiting for it for 7 years." "And?" She picked up her coffee cup. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "When Fitch calls back," she said, "I'm not going to be the one who answers." Hale looked at her steadily for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. "Who is?" he said. She set the cup down. "Someone with a federal case number and the authority to record the call," she said. She looked at the window again, at the gray flat morning and the dead grass and the particular quality of a day that was about to become something it hadn't been yet. Her phone showed 8:58 a.m. In 1 hour and 2 minutes, Gerald Fitch was going to call back, and the number he'd saved in his phone as Nora Voss was going to be answered by Lieutenant Colonel Diana Reeves, with the call logged as evidence in an active federal IG inquiry, and everything Fitch said in that conversation was going to become part of the record that Hargrove had just spent 2 years and a contractor operation trying to prevent from existing. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Reeves arrived at the house in Delmore at 9:40 a.m. She'd been driving since before Fitch's call, which meant she'd been moving toward this before any of them had known how the morning would break. She came in the back door, shook the cold off her jacket, accepted the coffee Stoll handed her without comment, and sat down at the kitchen table with her phone and her notebook and the particular focus of someone who had been doing the work in their head during the drive and was now ready to do it out loud. Nora walked her through the call. Every word she could recall, Fitch's name, his phrasing, the offer's structure, the 2-hour window. Reeves listened, made 2 notes. He said mutual agreement that the events of the operation remain within the existing classification framework, she said. Those were his words? Close enough, he said, within the existing classification framework. That's not legal language. That's intimidation language dressed up as legal language. Reeves set her pen down. What it actually means is, don't tell anyone what you know, which is what they've been asking you to do for 7 years without using words. She looked at Nora steadily. When he calls back, I'll take it on your phone. You'll be in the room. I'll identify myself when I answer. I'm required to do that. And the call becomes a recorded interaction with an active federal inquiry. Whatever he says after that is voluntary. He'll hang up, Hale said. Probably, Reeves said. But the call attempt itself, in response to the inquiry filing, is already logged. And if he says anything before he figures out who he's talking to, she left that open. We set up in here, Nora's phone on the table. I'll be across from it. They set up. Stoll moved to the far end of the kitchen with his own phone. Hale stood near the door. Ranger sat beside Nora's chair with the patient weight of an animal that had decided this was where he was supposed to be and wasn't going to be argued out of it. At 10:58, the phone rang. Reeves answered on the second ring. Ms. Voss's phone, she said. This is Lieutenant Colonel Diana Reeves, Judge Advocate General's Corps. I'm currently managing communications on behalf of Ms. Voss in connection with a pending IG inquiry. This call is being recorded as part of that process. Can I ask who's calling? 4 seconds of silence. Then the line went dead. Nobody in the kitchen said anything for a moment. He'll call Hargrove in the next 60 seconds, Stoll said. And Hargrove will call his actual attorney, Reeves said. She was already typing. Which is what I want. The moment he retained separate legal counsel in response to the IG filing, he's acknowledged the inquiry's legitimacy. Every move he makes from here is a move inside the federal process. She looked up. He just stepped out of the shadows. The next 11 days moved the way things moved when institutional machinery finally engaged with something it had been avoiding. Slowly at first, then with a momentum that surprised everyone except the people who had built the case and knew exactly what was in it. The IG inquiry expanded within 48 hours of Reeves's filing. The signals traced data from the DIA contact landed in the case file on the second day, and the node designator matches were confirmed by a second independent analyst Reeves had requested as a matter of procedure. The contractor account records for Daltrey Operational Services were subpoenaed on day 3, and what they contained went further than anyone had framed it publicly. 3 years of records access, 14 separate requests against personnel connected to Nora's former unit, and a payment structure that showed Hargrove's current command had been authorizing contractor expenditures that didn't correspond to any documented operational requirement. Yolanda Marsh's documentation was entered into the record on day 4. The clerk who had noticed the irregular date range on a records request 3 years ago, who had kept a waterproof envelope in a locked filing cabinet because her mother had worked in insurance adjusting and she'd been raised to document things that felt wrong, that woman's thoroughness became a linchpin. The specified date range on the request, stopping 2 days before the operation, gave investigators the ability to show exactly what had been pulled and exactly what had been excluded, and the exclusion pattern was as clear as a signature. Dwight Farrow gave a formal statement on day 5. He drove to a federal building in Portland and sat across from an investigator for 3 hours and described everything he remembered about the operation, the route, the abort, and the aftermath. He was not a polished witness. He stopped twice to collect himself, once when describing the lit-up position they would have been standing in, and once when describing what the following year had looked like for the members of their element. The investigator noted in the transcript that Mr. Farrow's account was consistent with documentation already in evidence at every verifiable point. Terrence Galt's accident was reviewed on day 6. The original accident report had attributed the crash to black ice on a highway overpass in November, 14 months after Golt's discharge. The review found that the accident had been investigated by a local department with no federal consultation. A supplementary reconstruction analysis, requested by the IG office, found that the vehicle's brake system showed wear patterns inconsistent with the mileage on record. The analysis was inconclusive as to cause, but it was entered into the file, and the file kept growing. Nora knew about all of this in real time because Reeves updated her daily, not out of obligation, but because Reeves believed, and had said so directly, that the person who built the foundation of a case deserved to see what the builders were doing with it. She spent those 11 days in a particular kind of suspension. She couldn't work. The licensing board process was still technically active, held in a jurisdictional argument that her attorney, a woman named Petra Solis, whom Stoll had connected her to on day 2, was fighting methodically and without visible panic. She couldn't go back to her apartment, not because it was unsafe, but because she'd been told to maintain a consistent location for contact purposes. She stayed in the Delmore house. She cooked because there was a kitchen and food, and it gave her hands something to do. She walked in the yard in the mornings with Ranger, who had become her shadow in a way that felt earned rather than assigned. She called her mother on day 3. Her mother lived in eastern Colorado and had been not asking about things for 7 years with the practiced diplomacy of a woman who had learned that asking got you less than waiting. Nora told her some of it, not the operational details, the shape of it, that something old was being looked at properly, finally, and that she was okay, that she was not in danger, that she was in a house in Oregon with people she trusted. Her mother was quiet for a moment and then said, "Did you eat?" "Yes." "Real food or hospital cafeteria food?" "Real food. I made soup." "Good," her mother said. And that was it. Not because she didn't care, but because she'd understood for a long time that her daughter didn't need commentary. She needed to know someone was on the other end of the line. Nora held the phone for a moment after she hung up. She was 39 years old, and she had spent 7 years being invisible because the alternative had seemed like a wall she couldn't move. And now the wall was moving, and she didn't know yet what was on the other side of it, which was its own particular kind of fear. Not the sharp fear of immediate danger, but the slower, stranger fear of open space after a long time in a small one. On day 9, Gerald Fitch and 2 associates from Daltrey Operational Services were interviewed under oath by IG investigators. The interview was not voluntary. The subpoenas had been issued on day 7, and Fitch had spent 48 hours attempting to have them quashed through 2 separate motions, both of which were denied within hours by a federal judge who appeared to have very little patience for process objections in the middle of an active misconduct inquiry. Nora wasn't in the room. She didn't need to be. Reeves called her that evening and described the key points of what had emerged. Fitch had retained separate counsel from Daltrey and answered questions about his personal role only. The Daltrey operational records, however, spoke without anyone's cooperation. 14 personnel file requests, authorization codes that traced to a command account that traced to Hargrove's staff, payment authorizations signed by a contracting officer who had since been reassigned to a post in Germany. That contracting officer was contacted by investigators on day 10. He cooperated fully and immediately, with the speed of someone who had been waiting for an opportunity to not be the last person standing between the evidence and the exit. His cooperation produced a document that none of them had known existed. An internal communication sent through the Daltrey system rather than any military channel, dated 18 months after Nora's discharge. It was addressed to Fitch and copied to a person identified only by an account designation, an account that, when unmasked by investigators, belonged to a senior staff officer who had served under Hargrove at the relevant command and was now assigned to the Pentagon. The communication described, in terms that were professionally oblique but legally transparent, the need to maintain what it called the operational integrity of certain historical records related to a field element incident in year -7. It described monitoring the element's surviving members. It mentioned, in one sentence, a compliance review that might be useful should any member of the element become professionally inconvenient. The word used was inconvenient. 7 years ago, someone had written the word inconvenient about her in a memo and filed it in a contractor's server, and it had sat there until a contracting officer in Germany decided he didn't want to be the last person holding it. She read the document on Reeves's screen on day 10, sitting in the JAG officer's temporary office space at the Calverton Federal Courthouse Annex, and felt something she couldn't name precisely. Not relief exactly, not satisfaction, but the particular feeling of seeing a thing made legible that had lived in you for years, a sensation without language. "This is enough," Reeves said. "This has been enough for 3 days. I wanted you to see it." "What happens now?" Nora said. "The inquiry moves to formal investigation status. That triggers mandatory notification to the Promotion Review Board. Hargrove's package is pulled from consideration pending outcome." Reeves folded her hands on the desk. "The Pentagon staff officer on the copy line has already been placed on administrative hold pending his own interview. Hargrove's legal team filed a response this morning disputing the document's chain of custody, which is the last available procedural argument, and they know it. Will it work?" "No," Reeves said, with the flatness of certainty. "The chain of custody is documented to the originating server, their own system." Nora nodded. "The licensing board matter," she said. "Petra told me yesterday that the jurisdictional argument was resolved." "It was resolved in your favor on day 8, Reeves confirmed. "The state matter is preempted by the federal inquiry. The chart amendment has been referred to the state medical board as potential tampering, with Wakefield named as the signatory. That investigation is separate from ours and will move on its own timeline." She thought about Wakefield. 29. Second year of residency. The sentence, "You're just a nurse," delivered with the tired confidence of someone who didn't know yet what it cost to say things like that. She didn't know what had been promised to him or what pressure had been applied. She didn't know how a person at the beginning of their career made the calculation he'd made. She'd spent some hours being angry about it and then stopped. Not because the anger wasn't warranted, but because she understood, in the cold way you understood things after long enough, that the people who used Wakefield were the ones who deserved the weight of it. He was a vehicle. They had driven him. That didn't fully excuse him, but it was accurate. The formal public announcement came on day 14. Not a press conference. Those came later. A notification in the DoD's Standard Inquiry Bulletin, which most people never read, but which reporters who covered military affairs monitored carefully. The item was 3 sentences. A formal investigation had been opened into conduct related to a promotion package under review. The flag officer concerned had been notified. The promotion timeline was suspended pending resolution. Within 6 hours, the story had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By the following morning, it had 8. Nora read the coverage at the kitchen table in Delmore with a cup of coffee and the morning light coming through the window at the angle it came through every morning at this hour. The stories were factually thin. They had the outline but not the details, the who without the why, the shape of something without its interior. She read them the way you read something about yourself that was true but incomplete, and felt the strangeness of being a person inside a story that was being told from the outside. One reporter, a woman named Ellen Carver, who wrote for a national military affairs publication, reached out through Petra Solis and asked for an interview. Nora declined for now, not because she didn't want to tell it eventually, but because the right time wasn't while investigators were still building and the wrong word in the wrong place could clip a wire in the process. Patience, she had learned, was not passive. It was a skill. It was something you practiced until it was available to you under pressure, and it had taken her years and cost her more than she could fully account for. But she had it now the way she had other things she'd paid for with years. Hargrove resigned his commission on day 19. She learned about it from Stull, who called at 7 in the morning with a voice that carried something she hadn't heard in it before. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of settled relief. The relief of a person who had been holding tension for 2 months and finally felt it release. The resignation was framed, in the official statement, as a personal decision made in light of the ongoing review. It was the language of a controlled retreat. It meant lawyers and the Army had reached an arrangement that allowed him to leave before the formal investigation produced findings that would have removed any choice from the equation. It was not a public confession. It was not a court-martial. It was a door closing quietly on a career that had been built on a silence he could no longer maintain. She sat with that for a while, thought about whether it was enough. It wasn't everything she'd imagined in the abstract, the kind of justice that came with a public reckoning and a formal accounting of every specific thing that had been done. Real outcomes were messier than imagined ones. The resignation was its own kind of acknowledgement, even if no one used that word. A general didn't resign from a commission he'd spent 3 decades building because an inquiry was going to find nothing. She knew what it meant, Stoll knew what it meant, Reeves knew what it meant. The 5 people who had walked out of that drainage depression 7 years ago, 200 meters from where they were supposed to be standing, knew what it meant. Fitch and 2 Daltrey associates faced federal obstruction and witness intimidation charges. The Pentagon staff officer on the memo's copy line was referred for court-martial review. The contracting officer in Germany received reduced sentencing consideration in exchange for his continued cooperation, which Nora thought was probably the right call, even though it felt uneven, the way most practical decisions did when you were close enough to see all their edges. On day 22, Petra Solis called to tell her that the Oregon State Nursing Board had formally cleared her license. The jurisdictional argument had been resolved so completely in the federal case's favor that the licensing board had closed its file without conducting any proceedings. Her suspension from Hale Orthopedic and Trauma Center was rescinded. A letter from Thornfield's office was already in the mail, she was told, which struck her as a particularly administrative way to handle the fact that they'd suspended someone who had saved a patient's life, while someone in their compliance office was submitting false documentation. She called Patricia that evening. "The night of the Jalen situation," Patricia said, about 30 seconds into the call. "I knew. I didn't know what was happening specifically, but I knew the timing of that complaint was wrong." "Why didn't you say anything?" Nora asked, not accusatory, just curious. A pause. "I have 17 years at that hospital," Patricia said, "and I have 2 kids. I'm not—" She stopped. "I'm not you. I don't have whatever it is you have." "I didn't have a choice," Nora said. "That's different from being brave." "Is it?" She thought about that after she hung up. Whether the distinction she'd drawn was real or just something she told herself to keep from feeling like a person who was owed more than she'd received. She'd made the abort call 7 years ago because her body had known before her mind did, and she'd kept the documentation because something in her had refused to accept that evidence of the truth should just disappear. Neither of those things had felt like bravery at the time. They'd felt like the only available option. Maybe that was what courage actually was, most of the time. Not the felt sense of being brave, but the simple inability to do the other thing, to walk past the wrong chart, to take the route, to hand over the envelope. She went back to work on a Thursday. Not a ceremony about it, just a Thursday. She clocked in at 6:47, the same time she always clocked in, and the same linoleum and the same fluorescent light, and Patricia at the handoff station moving through the night's cases with the same efficient 4-minute speed. Some people looked at her differently. She noticed it in the way you notice things you'd rather not make a point of. A particular quality of attention from people in the hallways, a pause before someone spoke to her, the kind of careful courtesy that comes with not knowing what to say to someone whose story you've recently become aware of. She didn't need them to say anything. She needed them to hand her the chart and get out of the way. Wakefield was not there. He was on an unpaid leave of absence pending the state medical board's review of the chart amendment. She didn't know how that would resolve. She thought he was young enough that if he spent some years understanding what he'd been a part of, it might count for something eventually. She wasn't sure. She'd stopped managing her expectations about what other people did with their lessons. The patient in Bay 4 that first night back was a woman in her 60s, admitted for abdominal pain that had been assessed by the ER doc as likely musculoskeletal and flagged as low priority. Nora read the chart, read the vitals trend over the 3 hours since admission, went in and talked to her for 10 minutes, and came back out and requested an abdominal ultrasound. The ER doc, not Wakefield, someone she hadn't met before, a woman named Rourke, who had the tired confidence of someone at least 5 years further into her training, looked at the request and then looked at Nora. "Walk me through your reasoning," Rourke said, not dismissively, just asking. So Nora walked her through it. The pain pattern, the mild fever that the chart had noted without escalating, the way the patient had described the onset, the specific quality of tenderness she'd found on palpation. It took about 90 seconds. Rourke ordered the ultrasound. It found a gallbladder in the early stages of acute cholecystitis. The patient was admitted for observation and surgical consult. Rourke found Nora at the station 2 hours later and said, "Good catch." Just that. 2 words. No ceremony about it. "Thanks," Nora said, and kept charting. It was, she thought, exactly the right size for the moment. Not everything needed to be witnessed at the scale it cost to produce. Some things just needed to happen. And then you moved on to the next thing. And the accumulation of those small right decisions was what the work actually was. What? 3 weeks after she went back to work, Reeves called. The formal investigation had concluded its preliminary phase. The findings were being summarized for the IG's report, which would be released in a redacted form to the public and in full to the relevant congressional oversight committees. Nora's military discharge record had been flagged for administrative correction. The conduct charge was being formally withdrawn, the discharge classification amended. A letter from the Department of the Army would follow within 60 days confirming the correction. "Your record will be clean," Reeves said, "officially, in writing." Nora was in the break room, sitting on the edge of the counter with a cup of coffee, looking at the wall where someone had taped up a printout of a motivational quote that was slightly crooked and had been slightly crooked since she started working here, which told her something about the hospital's relationship with its own signage. "What about the other element members?" she said. "The ones in the investigation file, their records." The IG's findings include a recommendation for review of any adverse personnel actions connected to individuals associated with the flagged command decisions, Reeves said. "That's broad language that covers your former element members. It doesn't happen automatically, but it creates the mechanism." She paused. "Pharaoh knows. He called me this morning." "How was he?" "He cried," Reeves said, "and then apologized for crying." "He doesn't need to apologize for that." "I told him the same thing." She looked at the crooked motivational quote on the wall. Some things just wanted to stay a little off. "That was fine. That was most things." "Reeves," she said, "when you started this, when Stoll first described the case to you, what made you take the drive?" A pause. Not the hesitant kind, the considering kind. "I've seen a lot of cases where someone did the right thing and the institution protected itself instead of the person," Reeves said slowly. "And most of the time I can do something inside the margins of the process, and it helps a little, and the person goes on, and I go on, and the institution learns nothing." She paused again. "Your case had evidence, real evidence, held by a real person, for 7 years, because that person understood somehow that the truth needed a physical location. I've worked cases where the truth was obvious, and there was nothing to show anyone." A beat of silence. "You gave me something to work with. That mattered." "I gave you handwritten notes and disposable camera photographs," Nora said. "You gave me a foundation," Reeves said. "I built on it. That's how it's supposed to work." After she hung up, Nora sat on the counter for a few more minutes with the cold coffee and the crooked sign and the particular sounds of a hospital in the middle of a night shift. The distant cartwheels, the soft alert tones from down the hall, someone's footsteps moving with the specific purpose of a person who knows where they're going. She thought about 7 years, not as a loss exactly, more as the space it takes to understand what you're carrying and why you're still carrying it. She'd been invisible for those years in the way that a lot of people were invisible. Not erased, but muted, their volume turned down by people who found the alternative inconvenient. She'd paid bills and worked shifts and kept a folder in the back of a cabinet and tried to close the distance between who she'd been and who she was currently allowed to be. And she hadn't stopped. That mattered, maybe more than the outcome. Not because the outcome didn't matter. It did. It had. She needed it. But because outcomes were what happened when you kept going. You didn't manufacture them. You earned the conditions for them by refusing, again and again, to be the version of yourself that other people found more manageable. The world had told her to make herself small. The chair across from Thornfield. The conversation in the hallway outside Wakefield's Bay. The pawn shop counter with the medals in the pouch, and the calculation of what she could get for them. Small, small, small. That was what the pressure said, and she had been tired enough and scared enough that she'd come close. But she hadn't. She set the coffee cup down and slid off the counter and straightened her scrubs and went back to work. Hale was in the lobby when she came off shift at 7 in the morning. He was sitting in one of the waiting area chairs with Ranger beside him and a paper coffee cup in his hand and the look of someone who had been there long enough to get comfortable. She stopped when she saw him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I was in the area." "It's 7 in the morning." "I like mornings," he said, which was probably true and also not the whole answer, and she let it be both of those things. They walked out together into the cold early air of Calverton, Oregon, the light coming in low and pale and generous in the way winter light sometimes was, spreading itself across the parking lot and the street beyond it and the tops of the buildings further east where the city was already waking up and doing what cities did, which was mostly not pay attention to the individual stories unfolding inside it. Ranger walked between them, then slightly ahead, moving with the purposeful ease of a dog who had decided the pace. She thought about what she was going to do next. Not today. Today she was going to sleep and eat something real and call her mother. But beyond that, the investigation had created a document, and the document would have a public version, and Ellen Carver at the Military Affairs publication was still waiting. Reeves had mentioned on one of the later calls that the IG report's findings were likely to prompt congressional interest in contractor oversight practices, and that there might be utility in a civilian voice, a nurse's voice, speaking to what that kind of institutional machinery could do to a person's life. She wasn't sure she wanted to be that voice. She wasn't sure she didn't. She'd figure it out. What she knew was this. She was 39 years old, and she had her license back and her record clean, and 6 people who had walked off a hillside 7 years ago were starting, slowly, to be seen. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, close to everything she'd allowed herself to want for a very long time. The problem with systems that erase people is that they depend on the erased person cooperating with their own disappearance. They depend on exhaustion, on isolation, on the slow arithmetic of costs and calculations that convinces you the fight isn't worth it, that the truth doesn't need a physical location, that nobody is looking for what you have. She had been exhausted. She had done the arithmetic. She had stood at a pawn shop counter with a bag of medals and thought, maybe this is just how it ends. But she had also, for 7 years, kept the folder. She had kept it because some part of her had refused the final surrender. Not dramatically, not with a speech, but with the small, relentless stubbornness of a person who kept a thing because it was true, and truth needed somewhere to live. That was the only lesson she had. It wasn't elegant. It didn't resolve cleanly. It just meant, keep the evidence. Keep going. Not because the outcome is guaranteed, but because you are the only person in the position to do it, and that is, in the end, enough of a reason. The light was getting stronger. Somewhere down the block, a bakery was opening, and the smell of it reached them briefly before the wind shifted. Ranger looked back at her once, checking, the way he did. She nodded at him. They kept walking.